What if I told you that the very idea of a world order, of nations bound by law, treaties, and shared rules, was born not in Washington or Geneva, but in a quiet study in Spain, for centuries before the United Nations ever existed? In 1494, two men sat at a table in the small Spanish town of Tordesillas and drew an invisible line across the entire planet. With the stroke of a pen, they divided a world neither of them had fully seen between two crowns. That line would spark empires, wars, revolutions, and a global struggle for power that still echoes in the diplomacy of today. This is the story of how Spain and the Americas became locked together in the birth, and the transformation, of the modern international system. In the late 15th century, the world that European monarchs understood was small. It stretched from the icy ports of the North Atlantic to the spice markets of the Eastern Mediterranean, bounded by oceans believed to be impassable and lands believed to be unreachable. Spain, freshly unified under the joint rule of Isabella of Castile and Ferdinand of Aragon, had just completed the centuries-long Reconquista, expelling the last Muslim rulers from Granada in January 1492. The same year, in August, a Genoese navigator named Christopher Columbus set sail westward across the Atlantic, financed by the Castilian crown, seeking a route to Asia. What he found instead, on October 12, 1492, was land that Europeans had never recorded, islands in the Caribbean that would soon be called the Indies, and later, the Americas. This single voyage did something far more consequential than open a trade route. It forced Europe's monarchies to confront a question that had never existed before: who has the right to claim land on the other side of the world, and by what authority? The answer, in 1493 and 1494, came not from soldiers but from a pope and a treaty table. Pope Alexander VI issued a series of papal bulls attempting to divide newly discovered lands between Spain and Portugal, the two great maritime powers of the Iberian Peninsula. Portugal, unsatisfied with the initial division, negotiated directly with Spain, and the result was the Treaty of Tordesillas, signed on June 7, 1494. This treaty drew a meridian line roughly 370 leagues west of the Cape Verde Islands. Everything to the east would belong to Portugal, everything to the west would belong to Spain. It is difficult to overstate how radical this was. For the first time, two European powers had attempted to govern the entire globe through a bilateral legal agreement, sanctioned by religious authority, without consulting any of the peoples who actually inhabited the lands being divided. Historians regard Tordesillas as one of the earliest expressions of what would become international law, a system of treaties, sovereignty claims, and recognized boundaries between competing states. It was, in a very real sense, the rough scaffolding of the modern international system, the idea that the world could be ordered through agreements between great powers. Spain moved quickly to make its claim real. Hernán Cortés landed in Mexico in 1519 and, through a combination of alliances with rival indigenous groups, superior weaponry, and the devastating impact of European diseases, brought down the Aztec Empire by 1521. Francisco Pizarro followed a similar path against the Inca Empire in Peru, capturing the Emperor Atahualpa in 1532 and effectively ending Inca imperial rule within a few short years. These were not isolated conquests, they were the foundation of an administrative system. Spain established viceroyalties: New Spain, centered in Mexico City, and Peru, centered in Lima, governed directly by the crown through appointed viceroys, audiencias, and a vast bureaucratic apparatus designed to extract wealth and maintain control across an ocean's distance. The wealth that flowed from this system reshaped the entire structure of global power. Silver mined at Potosí, in modern-day Bolivia, and at Zacatecas, in Mexico, financed Spanish armies in Europe, paid for the Habsburg dynasty's wars, and circulated through global trade networks that reached as far as Ming China, where Spanish silver coins became a standard currency. Spain, almost overnight in historical terms, became the wealthiest and most feared power in Europe. King Charles I of Spain, who was also Holy Roman Emperor Charles V, ruled over territories so vast that contemporaries said the sun never set on his empire, a phrase that would later be applied to other empires, but which originated in the Spanish context. Yet this concentration of power did not go unchallenged. Other European states, England, France, and the Dutch Republic, refused to accept the legitimacy of a world divided by papal decree between only two Catholic powers. Spain's claim to a hemisphere, however legally formalized at Tordesillas, was contested from the very beginning by privateers, pirates, and rival colonial ventures. English sailors like Francis Drake raided Spanish treasure fleets and Pacific ports throughout the late 16th century, and the eventual defeat of the Spanish Armada in 1588 signaled that Spain's monopoly on the new transatlantic order would not last forever. What emerged from this clash was something genuinely new in the history of international relations, a competitive system of overlapping colonial claims, in which European powers projected their rivalries onto American soil. The Caribbean became a battleground not because of local disputes but because of dynastic and religious conflicts thousands of miles away in Europe. This is a crucial point for understanding the modern international system. Before Spain's encounter with the Americas, the major political conflicts of Europe were largely contained within Europe and the Mediterranean world. After 1492, every major European war had an American dimension, and every American colony was a piece on a global chessboard. The Spanish administrative system itself left a lasting imprint on how international relations would be conducted in the centuries that followed. The Council of the Indies, established in 1524, functioned as a centralized bureaucratic body overseeing law, governance, and policy across the entire Spanish-American Empire, an early example of a state managing distant territories through codified law rather than purely military force. The laws of Burgos in 1512 and later the new laws of 1542 attempted, with limited success, to regulate the treatment of indigenous peoples, reflecting an emerging, if deeply flawed and frequently ignored, notion that even conquered peoples existed within some framework of law and obligation, a precursor to later debates about sovereignty, rights, and the responsibilities of states toward populations under their control. By the end of the 16th century, Spain had constructed something unprecedented, a transatlantic empire governed from Madrid, financed by American silver, contested by European rivals, and justified through a blend of religious mission and legal claim. The foundations of a genuinely global political system, one in which events in the Americas shaped policy in Europe and vice versa, had been laid. The next chapters of this story would test whether Spain could hold on to what it had built, as new powers rose to challenge an order that had once seemed unshakable. The empire Spain built in the 16th century was a marvel of early modern statecraft, but empires, like all human institutions, are subject to the slow erosion of time, overreach, and rival ambition. By the 17th century, the very wealth that had made Spain the most powerful nation in Europe began to work against it. The constant flow of American silver fueled inflation across the Spanish economy, a phenomenon economic historians later called the price revolution. Spain's rulers, flush with bullion, borrowed heavily against future shipments of silver to finance wars across Europe, against the Dutch in their long rebellion, against France, against the Ottoman Empire in the Mediterranean. The crown defaulted on its debts multiple times during this period, a striking irony for a state sitting atop the richest mines in the known world. Meanwhile, other European powers were learning from Spain's example and improving upon it. England, France, and the Dutch Republic established their own colonies in North America and the Caribbean during the 17th century, chartering joint stock companies that distributed risk and reinvested profit more efficiently than Spain's centralized crown monopoly. The Dutch East India Company and later the Dutch West India Company demonstrated that commercial enterprise, rather than purely royal administration, could project power just as effectively. Spain's American Empire, by contrast, remained heavily bureaucratic, taxed through the Casa de Contratación in Seville, and increasingly vulnerable to smuggling, piracy, and the slow but steady decline of silver output as the most accessible deposits were exhausted. The 18th century brought a different kind of test, the rise of Enlightenment political philosophy and the example of successful rebellion. When Britain's 13 North American colonies declared independence in 1776 and secured it with French and, notably, Spanish assistance by 1783, they demonstrated to the entire Western Hemisphere that colonial rule was not an unbreakable fact of political life. Spain had actually supported the American revolutionaries against Britain, its imperial rival, never anticipating that the example set by the United States would soon inspire rebellion against Spanish rule itself. The spark that truly ignited Spanish-American independence came not from the colonies directly, but from Europe. In 1808, Napoleon Bonaparte invaded Spain, forced King Charles IV and his son Ferdinand VII to abdicate, and installed his own brother, Joseph Bonaparte, on the Spanish throne. This crisis of legitimacy, a Spanish crown occupied by a foreign usurper, shattered the chain of authority that had bound the American colonies to Madrid for nearly 3 centuries. Local governing councils, called juntas, sprang up across Spanish America, initially proclaiming loyalty to the deposed Ferdinand VII but increasingly asserting their own right to self-governance in his absence. What followed was nearly 2 decades of revolutionary warfare across the Americas. Simón Bolívar, born in Caracas, emerged as the preeminent military and political leader of independence movements in the northern regions of South America, leading campaigns that liberated what are now Venezuela, Colombia, Ecuador, and Bolivia. His counterpart in the south, José de San Martín, led forces across the Andes from Argentina into Chile and then Peru, coordinating with Bolívar's forces to squeeze Spanish royalist armies from both directions. In Mexico, the independence movement began with a different character entirely, a 1810 uprising led by the priest Miguel Hidalgo, which evolved over a decade of conflict before achieving independence in 1821 under different leadership. By 1825, Spain had lost nearly all of its mainland American empire. The decisive military defeats at battles like Boyaca in 1819, Carabobo in 1821, and Ayacucho in 1824 effectively ended royalist resistance on the South American continent. What remained of Spain's American holdings were a handful of Caribbean islands, Cuba and Puerto Rico, which would remain under Spanish control for several more decades, becoming, in a sense, the final fragments of an empire that had once spanned an entire hemisphere. This collapse reshaped the modern international system in ways that extended far beyond Spain and its former colonies. The newly independent Latin American republics adopted constitutions heavily influenced by Enlightenment political theory, the United States model, and French revolutionary ideals, creating a new category of sovereign state in international law, post-colonial republics asserting equal standing with European monarchies. The United States, watching this transformation, issued the Monroe Doctrine in 1823, declaring that European powers should not attempt to recolonize or interfere in the Western Hemisphere, a policy that simultaneously supported Latin American independence while asserting growing American hemispheric influence. For Spain, the loss of its American empire triggered a prolonged crisis of national identity and a fundamental repositioning within the European balance of power. A nation that had once dominated global trade routes and dictated terms to rival empires now found itself increasingly peripheral to the great power politics of 19th-century Europe, overshadowed by the industrializing strength of Britain, France, and a rapidly unifying Germany. Spain's domestic politics through much of the 19th century were marked by instability, civil wars, contested successions, and repeated swings between liberal constitutionalism and conservative monarchy, partly a consequence of the economic and psychological shock of imperial collapse. The final blow to Spain's remaining American presence came in 1898. Tensions over Cuban independence movements, American commercial interests, and the explosive sinking of the USS Maine in Havana Harbor in February 1898 led the United States to declare war on Spain. The Spanish-American War lasted only a matter of months, but it was decisive and humiliating for Spain. The Treaty of Paris, signed in December 1898, forced Spain to cede Puerto Rico, Guam, and the Philippines to the United States and to relinquish its claim to Cuba. In the span of a single year, for centuries of Spanish presence in the Americas effectively came to an end. For many Spanish intellectuals and politicians, 1898 became known as El Disaster, the disaster, a symbolic and literal end to Spain's identity as an imperial power, forcing a painful national reckoning that would shape Spanish politics and culture well into the 20th century. The 20th century opened for Spain with a profound sense of national diminishment. The loss of Cuba, Puerto Rico, and the Philippines in 1898 had stripped away the last vestiges of Spain's once vast American empire, and the country turned inward, grappling with questions of modernization, regional identity, and political stability that would dominate its domestic affairs for decades. Yet even as Spain's direct territorial connection to the Americas faded, its cultural, linguistic, and economic ties to the now independent Latin American republics remained deep, complex, and increasingly important to how both Spain and the wider international system understood the concept of a shared Hispanic or Ibero-American identity. Spain's internal turmoil reached a catastrophic peak in 1936, when a military uprising led by General Francisco Franco against the democratically elected Republican government plunged the country into a brutal civil war. The conflict, which lasted until 1939, became a proxy battleground for the ideological struggles convulsing the rest of Europe. Nazi Germany and Fascist Italy supported Franco's nationalist forces with troops, aircraft, and material, while the Soviet Union backed the Republican government, and thousands of international volunteers, including many Americans organized in units like the Abraham Lincoln Brigade, traveled to Spain to fight against fascism. Latin American nations were divided in their sympathies as well, with Mexico under President Lázaro Cárdenas providing significant support to the Spanish Republic, including granting asylum to tens of thousands of Republican refugees after Franco's victory in 1939. Franco's eventual triumph established an authoritarian dictatorship that would govern Spain for nearly 4 decades. Internationally, Franco's regime occupied an awkward position. Despite ideological sympathies with the Axis powers, Spain remained officially neutral during the Second World War, a calculated decision that allowed Franco to avoid the devastation experienced by Germany and Italy, though it left Spain diplomatically isolated in the war's immediate aftermath. The newly formed United Nations initially excluded Spain from membership, and many countries withdrew their ambassadors from Madrid in protest of Franco's fascist-aligned government. It was in this context of post-war isolation that Spain's relationship with the United States, and indirectly with the broader American hemisphere, took on renewed strategic importance. As the Cold War intensified in the late 1940s and 1950s, American policymakers increasingly viewed Franco's fiercely anti-communist Spain as a useful strategic partner, despite the regime's authoritarian character. This culminated in the 1953 Pact of Madrid, through which the United States gained access to military bases in Spain in exchange for economic aid and diplomatic support, a relationship that helped end Spain's international isolation and paved the way for its admission to the United Nations in 1955. Spain's relationship with its former American colonies during the Franco years was shaped by a curious blend of paternalistic rhetoric and genuine cultural exchange. Franco's government promoted the concept of Hispanidad, an ideology emphasizing the shared linguistic, religious, and cultural heritage linking Spain to Latin America, partly as a tool to project Spanish influence and partly as a genuine reflection of historical ties. This was formalized in events like the annual Dia de la Hispanidad celebrations and through cultural and educational exchange programs, even as many Latin American nations, particularly those with strong democratic traditions, viewed Franco's dictatorship with considerable suspicion or outright hostility. The death of Franco in November 1975 opened an entirely new chapter, not only for Spain's domestic politics but for its role in the international system as a whole. Under King Juan Carlos I and the skillful political leadership of figures like Adolfo Suarez, Spain underwent a remarkably peaceful transition to democracy, culminating in a new democratic constitution ratified in 1978. This transition, often studied by political scientists as a model of negotiated democratization, transformed Spain almost overnight from an international pariah into an emerging democratic partner eager to reintegrate into Western institutions. Spain's democratic transition coincided with, and in some ways helped inspire, democratization movements across Latin America during the 1980s, as numerous countries, including Argentina, Brazil, Chile, and Uruguay, transitioned away from military dictatorships toward elected civilian governments. Spanish diplomats and political figures actively engaged with these transitions, drawing on their own recent experience, and Spain positioned itself as a natural bridge between Latin America and the increasingly important institutions of Western Europe, particularly as Spain pursued and achieved membership in the European Economic Community in 1986. This bridging role became institutionalized in 1991 with the creation of the Ibero-American Summit, an annual gathering of heads of state from Spain, Portugal, and Latin American nations, designed to foster cooperation on economic, cultural, and political matters across the historically linked but politically distinct Hispanic and Lusophone world. The summits represented a new kind of international architecture, not a colonial relationship, and not simply an alliance of convenience, but an attempt to formalize a shared historical and linguistic community into a functioning element of modern multilateral diplomacy, alongside bodies like the United Nations, the Organization of American States, and the European Union. Throughout the late 20th century, Spanish companies also became major economic actors across Latin America, particularly following the wave of privatizations that swept the region in the 1990s. Spanish banks, telecommunications firms, and energy companies invested heavily in countries like Argentina, Mexico, Brazil, and Chile, creating deep commercial interdependencies that added an economic dimension to the cultural and diplomatic ties binding Spain to its former colonies. By the close of the 20th century, Spain had transformed itself from a faded imperial power, isolated by dictatorship and stripped of its American territories, into a democratic European Union member state wielding renewed, if fundamentally different, influence across the Atlantic world, no longer through conquest or colonial administration, but through economic investment, cultural affinity, and active participation in multilateral institutions. By the dawn of the 21st century, Spain's relationship with the Americas had been fundamentally reimagined for a third time. The first transformation had been imperial conquest and colonial rule, lasting roughly 3 centuries. The second had been the painful severing of empire, stretching from the early 19th century wars of independence through the final loss of Cuba and the Philippines in 1898. The third transformation, still unfolding today, is one of economic interdependence, cultural diplomacy, and Spain's role as a connective node within a far more complex and multipolar global system than anything its 16th-century monarchs could have imagined. Spain's membership in the European Union, formalized in 1986, gave it a unique diplomatic position. As the EU developed increasingly coordinated foreign and trade policy throughout the 1990s and 2000s, Spain frequently positioned itself as the European voice most attuned to Latin American affairs, advocating for stronger EU-Latin America trade agreements and political dialogue. This role was not without friction. Spanish governments across the political spectrum, from the socialist administrations of Felipe González and José Luis Rodríguez Zapatero to the conservative governments led by figures like Mariano Rajoy, have had to balance close commercial relationships with Latin American nations against the EU's broader, sometimes more cautious, collective foreign policy positions. The economic dimension of this relationship deepened considerably during the 1990s and 2000s. Spanish multinational corporations, particularly in banking, telecommunications, and energy, expanded aggressively into Latin American markets following waves of privatization across the region. Companies such as Telefónica, Banco Santander, BBVA, and Repsol became major employers and investors across countries including Argentina, Brazil, Mexico, Chile, and Colombia. This investment was not always welcomed without controversy. Periods of political and economic instability in countries like Argentina, particularly during its severe financial crisis of 2001 and 2002, exposed Spanish companies to significant financial risk and occasionally provoked tensions over issues like asset nationalization, regulatory disputes, and accusations of excessive foreign corporate influence over national resources. Migration patterns added yet another layer to this evolving relationship, and in a historically reversed direction from earlier centuries. Throughout the early 21st century, significant numbers of Latin American migrants, particularly from Ecuador, Colombia, Bolivia, and the Dominican Republic, moved to Spain seeking economic opportunity, drawn partly by shared language and partly by Spain's relatively accessible visa and residency frameworks for nationals of former colonies. This migration reshaped Spanish demographics and urban culture in cities like Madrid and Barcelona, while also generating substantial remittance flows back to Latin American economies, creating a genuinely bidirectional human and economic relationship quite different from the one-directional colonial extraction of earlier centuries. Spain's diplomatic engagement with the Americas in the 21st century has also been shaped by its complicated, evolving relationship with the United States. As a NATO member since 1982 and a close European ally of Washington, Spain has generally aligned with broader transatlantic security priorities, though not without occasional friction, most notably when the socialist government of José Luis Rodríguez Zapatero withdrew Spanish troops from Iraq in 2004, shortly after taking office following the Madrid train bombings, a decision that created temporary strain in Spanish-American relations. More broadly, Spain has continued to serve as a kind of interpretive bridge, often advocating within EU and NATO circles for greater attention to Latin American political and economic developments, given its historical, linguistic, and commercial stakes in the region's stability. The institutional architecture connecting Spain to the Americas has also matured considerably. The Ibero-American Summits, now organized under the Ibero-American General Secretariat established in 2005, continue to convene regularly, addressing issues ranging from climate policy and digital transformation to educational cooperation and democratic governance. Spain has also played an active role in supporting democratic institutions and electoral observation missions across Latin America through bodies like the Organization of American States, even though Spain itself, as a European nation, holds only observer status rather than full membership in that hemispheric organization. Cultural and linguistic ties remain perhaps the most enduring and least contested dimension of the Spain-Americas relationship in the modern era. The Instituto Cervantes, Spain's principal institution for promoting Spanish language and culture globally, operates centers throughout Latin America and maintains close working relationships with national language academies across the Spanish-speaking world. The Real Academia Española, Spain's royal language authority, now coordinates closely with the Association of Academies of the Spanish Language, representing all Spanish-speaking nations in the Americas, reflecting a collaborative rather than hierarchical approach to managing a shared linguistic heritage, a striking contrast to the colonial-era assumption that linguistic and cultural authority flowed exclusively outward from Madrid. Today, Spain's position within the modern international system reflects the long arc of its history with the Americas. It is no longer an imperial center commanding distant colonies, nor is it merely a diminished former power nostalgic for lost glory. Instead, Spain functions as a mid-sized European power with disproportionate cultural, linguistic, and commercial influence across an entire hemisphere, a legacy of the very system it helped create at Tordesillas more than 5 centuries ago. The story that began with 2 diplomats drawing a line across an unexplored ocean has evolved into a genuinely multilateral, economically interdependent, and culturally rich relationship, proof that the international system, however it originates, is never static, but is constantly reshaped by the forces of decline, reinvention, and the enduring power of shared history.